I don't know whether at this point there are any questions.
Yes, there are some of them. So, ¿tenéis alguna? Jan está abierto ahora mismo a preguntas. ¿Tenéis alguna pregunta? La podéis poner en el chat en español si os sentís más cómodos, o la podéis formular en inglés simplemente levantando la mano. You can ask in Spanish, writing the question on the chat, and you can raise your hand or open your micro and make a question.
Yo no veo a todo el mundo, Miguel. No sé si tú puedes ver a todos, porque si levantan la mano, pero no, yo no veo todas las pantallas.
Abrid el micrófono si queréis y podéis hablar.
Estáis en casa.
Azucena.
Voy a hacerla en español. Una pregunta de clarificación. Según entiendo, es cómo lograr atravesar las 7 conversaciones acá en cada uno de los niveles donde cambia la naturaleza de la conversación porque difiere la complejidad de lo que resuelve ese layer, pero se habla de lo mismo. Es decir, cómo conectar las conversaciones a lo largo del sistema, diferenciando manteniendo el eje de qué se conversa, pero adaptándolo a la complejidad que resuelve cada nivel. Quiero chequear si estoy entendiendo correcto. No sé si fui medio atravesada mi pregunta.
Lo voy a intentar. I will try. I think Azucena is asking how to connect these different 7 conversations across them, connecting these 7 conversations while managing the complexity of each layer, because each layer has different level of complexity. So how to guarantee, how to ensure that you solve this complexity at the same time that you keep them in the same sphere of conversation. Espero más o menos, Azucena, haber formulado la pregunta.
Okay, thank you, Miguel.
Well, the answer is that you can only have the conversation within what people are able to understand at each layer. And that means basically that people differ in their complexity handling. And by differ in their complexity handling, and basically this is, I can go to my next slide. Basically, we know that there is a way of thinking about the world that develops throughout adulthood. For example, each one of us has develops from a single expert thinking, which we often develop while we were educated at university, for example, and then go through a process where they develop part-whole thinking, which is seeing the bigger picture, but also being able to make explicit how a part functions in the whole. And that's often what happens in, you see also here the colors, that's also what happens within the continuous improvement domain, while single expert thinking is happening within the quality and service domain. So in the conversations, it will be important to shift to the next higher level of thinking in order to come to a kind of a higher level of integration of the thinking and the handling of tensions. If you start with coherence thinking, for example, in the quality and service domain, they will often say, well, we do not understand you, or you do not have, you're insufficiently in touch with our reality, because that's the next higher level of thinking. Coherence thinking is about understanding the critical relationships and the structures within critical relationships, while dynamic thinking is about making sense of what evolves. It is about redefining the past in order to change perspectives in the present, or redefine the future to handle things differently in the present. That's dynamic thinking. And metamorphosis thinking is about the real tensions and handling the tensions. It informs you how shape changes occur and what really needs to be coordinated. But there is a second thing in the perspective taking, which has to do with identity development, which touches upon the question, what is the meta perspective one can take on his or her own ego? And we know that in different layers in an organization, there is a different pattern visible of operating from a certain script or motivational field. It evolves from functioning in a very instrumental way, where ego and own performance are central, to operating in a other dependent way, focusing a lot on searching recognition, cohesion, respect, being member of a team. And at a certain point, people will experience that their boundaries are not respected, and they can move into a self-authoring way of functioning. That means that they will start operating from their own perspective. This is something that you need in the value streams domain, while dependent thinking dominates the continuous improvement domain, and instrumental thinking dominates the quality and service domain. But we all know that those different levels of development do not always develop in alignment with the complexity theme that you're mastering. We even have examples of a president, I won't point to the United States and Trump, but of someone who is expected to operate at a very high level of complexity, and did that from a very instrumental point of view, putting his own ego before everything. So in every organization, you have tensions between the complexity one is expected to handle, and the type of perspective taking that is necessary to operate fluently. And in each teamwork, you have a diversity of thinking. For example, in the continuous improvement domain, you have people that function from an expert, instrumental way and will focus on coordination of activities, versus people operating from a other dependent point of view, in part whole thinking, and will put a focus on cooperation. So what I suggest to make the complexity manageable is to start observing the dynamics that push the teamwork into either coordination, which means that in the continuous improvement domain, you will come to suboptimal decision making and probably rework, probably not meeting objectives or time milestones, or whether the dialogue is really focused on cooperation. And starting to look at that tension between coordination and cooperation, and observing who in the group forms a coalition, a temporary coalition with whom, helps you to kind of influence the different dialogues towards a more integrated, holistic decision making. But the same you have in the value stream domain. There you have a tension between cooperation and co-construction. The value stream domain is often the domain of middle management, or should be the domain of middle management in a company. When a middle management focuses too much on reviewing the modus operandi or even coordination and command and control, which is basically coordination, you will get dysfunction and you will get a less integrated decision making. While if the team manages in the value stream domain to focus on co-construction, you will come to better decision making in that domain. It doesn't make sense to try in the continuous improvement domain already go into the co-construction domain, because that will create breaks and gaps in the dialogue, and it will disable the continuous improvement domain to make progress. The same happens in the new future models or profitability domain, which should focus on co-modeling, but that gets into tension with the co-construction domain. What I observed is that the tension between continuous improvement and value stream domain often concentrates on the resources dialogue. If there is a coordination dialogue, it's often a dialogue that circles around the question to get more resources. There will not be a thinking in line of how can I do more with the existing resources, or can we do the same with less resources? That's what happens if you enter into the what I call cooperation, which takes place in the continuous improvement, in the higher up continuous improvement domain. The dynamic between new future models and value streams often revolves around the planning, the roadmap, and the interdependencies that need to be taken into account in that value stream domain. And what will be very important is to choose combinations of models that enable you to manage those interdependencies planning-wise, and to make planning-wise the distinction between project management, program management, and portfolio management. Portfolio management going more into the new future model or profitability domain, program management into the co-construction, because that forces a team to make explicit the relationships between the different projects, and project management, which is at the interface between the value streams and the continuous improvement domain. And in the interaction between new future models and value streams, you often have the modeling dialogues. But what's important is if you start working with this, to observe the narrowing dynamics, which always circle around stabilizing joint actions. It's kind of getting a focus into the dialogue, kind of reducing the variety. And the moment variety gets reduced, you have a huge risk that you cannot adapt anymore to the environment. Because the essence of Stafford Beer's model is that the operations at each layer in the organizations need to be able to handle the variety present in the environment. The moment you go into best practice, you exclude other options. And that's often characterized by quite linear cause and effect thinking. The reduction of the complexity to the parts and the description of problems as being very technical or well structured. The basic idea is that you can predict things, which is not corresponding with the reality we all face. The reality we all face is that there is always a balance to be found between the narrowing dynamics and the broadening dynamics. Broadening dynamics are about dynamic development. It's about looking for the next higher level. If you have a resources discussion, well, shift it into a more encompassing planning discussion and shift the more encompassing planning discussion to the modeling discussion so that you can start to build emerging practice. But the dynamic development will always have to do with managing the tensions of development. That means the tensions that one experiences in moving, for example, from working from his or her own ego to other dependency or from other dependency to becoming self-steering and self-authoring, or the tensions that people experience in the organization between quality and service and continuous improvement. And people are quite able to define the tensions they experience. As a facilitator, I try to bring those tensions to the table, and through open, deep thinking questions, I open the dialogue in what I define as their proximal zone of development, where I invite them to start having a meta-reflection on their own thinking. So instead of kind of thinking what is outside, I make people aware that how they frame the issues determines the outcome. How they frame evolving changes determine how they think about the future. And you can change, people can change the storylines that they use. We see that all over and over again in history, that we are quite able to make up storylines. And for me, the current management practice follows a storyline that is either grounded in the Tayloristic or Ford approach, or the Toyota self-steering approach. And you can change those models. You can change them and broaden the models. For example, the Toyota approach or the self-steering approach is now being challenged by the higher or ecosystemic approach by Chinese company, who is functioning quite differently and challenges even quite fundamentally the Toyota model. So you'll always see the tension between the narrowing dynamics and the broadening dynamics. And it perhaps makes sense to spend some time in reflecting upon how you can specifically recognize those narrowing and broadening dynamics in meetings.
So, Jan, Jan, sorry. There is a question here that maybe you want to take it.
Yes, certainly.
Yep. It's okay. So, Magdalena, please.
I think that's maybe me. I was just writing in the chat. I don't want to break the flow, but now that I got the opportunity, I'm gonna use it. First of all, Jan, thank you very much for this. Now that you started to talk about your practice in particular and how you approach your work with organizations, and how you make them aware of their, mental models and the metaphors they are using and the narratives they are using, I'm quite curious to know whether you are, how aware you make these organizations about the VSM model, the VSM jargon, your very own development of it. Like, is it because I'm thinking that it might be challenging, right, for them to grasp this in the first place. So I would be, because I also work with companies, and I always struggle, understanding which kind of how much I should give out about the theory of things for them to be able to get actionable material, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I quite understand what you mean. I often do not share the viable systems model, but I use it as a way to look at tensions that I can identify in the reality. So for me, also the viable systems model is a theory, but the practice does not always behave as the theory predicts. So I'm using the model to better identify for myself what happens in reality, but I did operationalize the model within the dynamic collaboration application, which contains a library of about 5,000 different processes that you can distinguish in organizations. And I have developed an algorithm that enables people to quickly see at what contribution team they operate and how they handle the complexity that comes with it. And if they handle the existing complexity in the full complexity, or whether they fragment things, and what happens when those fragmenting dynamics start to dominate the conversations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That helps. Thank you.
So, Jan, I have a question, and it's about people representation, because if I understood well, you said that people can handle decisions depending on their cognitive development. I try to put in my words is what capacity people have to understand and to deal with the complexity of the situation. So this, and you are splitting this in 5 different levels. So my question is how the organization can make people participate, and if they are not able to participate in these conversations, how the organization is able to develop them to participate.
Well, what I learned is to select help frames or help models that are in line with the complexity theme they operate on. For example, people working in the quality and service domain, you can help them to take a small step beyond the logical thinking by, for example, using the grip model or the Spock model. Spock means that you help them to see the multidimensionality of the situation, the S, the multidimensionality in the problem space, which is the P, the multidimensionality in the options that they have, and the different ways to summarize it. The grip is that you help them feel and see that depending on how they define the goals, their goals will always be in tension with other goals. The R is stimulating them to think about the roles involved. The I is about the interpersonal relationships, often within the quality and service domain, helping them to make the distinction between push and pull strategies. And the P in the GRIP model is about processes and defining the elementary process they are responsible for. But the Spock model and the GRIP model, you cannot use them at the value stream level, because those are not models that are designed to really design or redesign the whole value stream. What I often do in preparatory meetings is that I try to build a hypothesis of the cognitive fluidity that is in the team and the level of identity development that is present in the team, and I adapt the models according to the level. I keep on using Stafford Beer's, but I only Stafford Beer's approach, but I only use it from the value streams level onwards, because that's really where coherence and systemic thinking starts to appear. I will speak in my own name, I haven't found a lot of systemic thinking in people that are kind of trapped into quality and service roles or into continuous improvement. You can fully use systemic models from the domain of operational flows onwards in an organization.
I'm wondering then if this is something related with the specific field or sector, because, for example, we have experience working in the NGO and civil social organizations, where people working in the field, so people working in what you defined, or Stafford Beer defines as the one, the operational one, they have this systemic perception, this holistic perception of what is happening. So,
well,
and then
my advice is to be prudent. A lot of people talk in systemic terms, but you can only be sure that they think systemically if you probe deeper, if you ask deeper questions on how they see parts functioning in the whole, how they see the layeredness of things, how they work with patterns. Because the systemic storyline is especially in NGO work. I did some work for Oxfam. That's how I got familiar with NGOs. I got familiar with NGOs in healthcare. And I observed quite a gap between, at the one side, how they have broad visions and how they, in practice, build operating models that work or do not work. And also in those NGOs, you have a kind of layeredness. So my invitation is to really double and double check on whether or not, well, I would say what the quality of the systemic thinking is.
Of course, I completely agree. But this quality of systemic thinking also, this challenge also happened at higher levels. So in terms of, for example, not necessarily because you are up in the organization and you have more vision around you, you develop this systemic approach. Usually it's the opposite, because the pressure of the goals and the fragmentation.
Yeah. But every organization has a kind of a baseline of operating. The system in under view can operate from a quality and service point of view. And that's the basic layer in the organization. But you do have organizations which have the end-to-end value stream as the basic operation that they do and the basic nature of them. So you also need to be very clear on what is the system in focus, and what is the layeredness within the organization.